Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome to this evening's event, 9/11 and the War on Terror, Reflections, What's Next for British Muslims. As Zara Mohammed, the Secretary General of the Muslim Council Britain, I'm so delighted to welcome such an esteemed panel to today's event, really looking back and thinking about what has been the implications and the consequences of 20 years of the War on Terror, but also what are we going to do next? So I'm so grateful for all of our panelists who have joined us today. We've got Sir Iqbal Sokrani, Baroness Shami Chakrabarti, and Dr. Hellier, who will be joining us shortly as well. And before we begin, I'd like to start in the way that we normally do, which is with some Quran recitation. And I'd like to thank and welcome Qari Hisak.
Jazakallah khair, thank you.
Oh, sorry, Qari Hisak. Yep, I think.
Are we good to go? أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والضحى والليل إذا سجى ما ودعك ربك وما قلى وللآخرة خير لك من الأولى ولسوف يعطيك ربك فترضى ألم يجدك يتيما فآوى ووجدك ضالا فهدى ووجدك عائلا فأغنى فأما اليتيم فلا تقهر وأما السائل فلا تنهر وأما بنعمة ربك فحدث. And the English translation, sort of the chapters that I recited, is the beginning, which is the opening Surah Fatiha. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. Praise be to Allah, the Lord of all the worlds, the most gracious, the most merciful. Master of the day of judgment, it is you we worship, and upon you alone we call for help. Guide us to the straight path, the path of those you have blessed and favored, and not of those against whom there is anger, and not of those who are misguided. The second chapter I recited is called Surah Al-Duha, which is the morning hours, chapter 93 from the Quran. By the morning brightness, and by the night when it covers with darkness. Your Lord has not taken leave of you, O Muhammad, peace be upon him, nor has he detested you. Also, the hereafter is better for you than the first life, and your Lord is going to give you, and you will be satisfied. Did he not find you an orphan and give you refuge? And he found you lost and guided you. And he found you poor and made you self-sufficient. So as for an orphan, do not oppress him. And as for the petitioner, do not repel him. But as for the favor of your Lord, report it. Sadaqallahu al-Azim.
Thank you so much, Qari Hisak. Surah Al-Duha is one of my favorite surahs and such a beautiful way to start the session. And really appreciate you joining us this evening and hope you have a great rest of the day.
Assalamu alaikum.
Okay, assalamu alaikum. So thank you, everyone. And that kind of brings us, I guess, to the start of today's event. Just a little bit of housekeeping, of course, and we will be having a Q&A session towards the end. So if you do have any questions, please do put them in the chat. We'll get back to you. We are live streaming and recording this event. So hopefully, if you want to watch it later, or you feel free to share as well afterwards. And finally, the importance of this topic is really about engaging with you too. So we do value your comments and feedback in the chat too. And on that note, I think probably it's befitting for me to just set the scene a little bit. And personally, I was actually 10 years old when 9/11 happened. And I think that's such an important event that sparked all of this. But, you know, on the 11th of September in 2001, the world watched in horror as New York's Twin Towers came down a terrorist attack, which nearly took 3,000 lives. But I think the legacy of 9/11 was not only the tragedy of that day, but also the political and seismic events that kind of came afterwards as well, reverberating all over the world. And that was on the back of the war on terror, the global war on terror, and most famously the rhetoric of "you're either with us or against us," talk of an axis of evil, resulting in sanctions, foreign wars and occupations, drone strikes, claiming millions of lives and changing hundreds of millions of lives forever. And here in the UK, things would never really be the same again for British Muslims, who found themselves now as the other, framed and collectively demonized by the media and by sections of society and by politicians too. And with that, we saw the marked rise in Islamophobia, not just in the physical and verbal abuse, but also in the structural nature of the problem and the very idea that it became difficult to just live your life openly as a Muslim. I remember a friend who said to me, "Zara, I could never wear the headscarf. I would never get a job," you know, so real life consequences for all of us. And I think that brings us nicely on to this session today and why we've really brought our esteemed panel together. Sir Iqbal Sakrani, Baroness Chakrabarti, and Dr. Helia to really discuss what have been the consequences. I know with Sir Iqbal Sakrani, you know, definitely thinking about the journey of the MCB in responding to 20 years. We're coming up for our 25-year anniversary next year. So there is a lot to talk about, and I hope really at the end of this discussion we'll be able to get some true insight. So on that note, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Sir Iqbal Sakrani, the founding secretary of the Muslim Council of Britain, and of course, a key and leading figure in our community, a pioneer of sorts, and of course, a very important mentor to myself. So thank you so much for joining us on quite a tough and difficult topic. And I guess my first question for you really is, you know, on that day, you know, on 9/11 struck, and I am sure it sent shockwaves across the whole organization and really since then, you know, what was it like? What was that time within the Muslim Council and what the responsibility for us like?
Thank you, Zara. Yes, I'm okay. Thank you, Zara, for your kind introduction and for giving me the opportunity to join the esteemed panel that we have on such an important issue, subject matter that perhaps has more ramification now after 20 years than what happened on that particular day. I was basically working in the office, at my office, doing my usual sort of work. And the first call I got from my daughter in Coventry. And I vividly remember the first, I said, "Dad, are you okay? Is everything okay?" I said, "Yes, things are okay. Everything's moving on in normal way. What's happening?" So "Have you heard the news?" So I said, "No." She explained to me what has happened. She had just been in the news back in terms of the attack on the towers. And then the reaction that came out of that was that, "Dad, be careful where we go." Now that immediately struck me as to hear something that's happened way back thousands of miles away. And then suddenly she says, "Dad, you have to be careful where you go around." And then I get a call from my brother who's overseas, a very similar message coming in, that the huge things that's happened, and be careful as to where you go along and how things are moving about. The point that comes in here is that this rather a tragedy that took place, a callous attack that took place in the States, was not the loss of the 3,000 people there, and the effect it had on the families in that country, but all of us who had been abroad in different fields and areas were all directly connected. And this connection came a little bit more when they came out to know later on that, of course, the perpetrators of the attack happened to be of a Muslim background. Now, as soon as, of course, the event, then the media took over, and never in my life have I seen that many calls coming in, all seeking interviews, of course, some were pretty malicious in their approach and saying that, look, this is attack carried out by Muslims. Islamic ideology has been involved. What do you intend to do? How are you going to deal with Islam in this country? And of course, headlines in the media came in, which were pretty atrocious. And we knew that the real message of Islamophobia that was vibrating had now come up into the open, where one wonders the effect it would have on people who have very little knowledge about Islam and about the Muslim community. So immediately, at that time, we were really taken by the state of shock that really was prevailing, was something to absorb and see how we should really deal with this matter. Of course, the usual thing the MCB does on this sort of occasion is to issue a very strong and a powerful statement that came out and made it very, very clear in that aspect that this event was totally condemned. And I remember quite a bit of time in terms of helping with the drafting, that whoever is responsible for these dreadful, wanton attacks, we condemn them utterly. These are senseless and evil acts that appall all people of conscience, and making it absolutely clear that this has affected all of us, irrespective of what faith, culture, ethnicity you come from. However, the turnaround in the media was different. And here we had to then face the media, the other sectors we were working with, our friends in faith communities, the government. Of course, at that time, I must say, we had very good communication, and they were quite understanding as to how to deal with it. And that communications at every level started coming in. So we felt the best thing first is to bring in confidence in the community. So the MCB, with its affiliates, its members, we had started visiting different organizations, institutions, different parts of the country, meeting them, and really explaining the whole issue that they need to know that it has nothing to do with Islam, nothing to do with the Muslim community as such, per se, but the fact is that this has come upon us, and there will be this vile and very malicious media propaganda that goes on, and we have a huge responsibility. What do we do? With this huge challenge that's come in, we need greater responsibility in how we react, with moderation, with understanding, but be confident in ourselves. Because at the end of the day, as a responsible umbrella body of the Muslim community, the voice of the Muslims was quite crucial. And wherever opportunity was given to us, of course, I felt, it was not a great interview where we were able to, just condemn and say, what do we do now? What are you going to do? What can I do? What can we do? The question comes in, it's a collective responsibility that was there. And this was the emphasis that we gave in. As far as then of course, we felt it was important for us to meet all the media, mainstream newspapers, mainstream media, TV and the radio channels. One-to-one meetings took place with our media team, where some very positive results came up. I remember editorial that came up from the Sun that said that it's important for the non-Muslim community to engage with the Muslim neighbors and give them the support and the confidence that it is not an issue where they can be blamed directly for this evil act. That was one positive. But on the other hand, we had the headlines that come from the Daily Express: Muslim bomb London. That was in one of the incendiary devices that had come in. And the headline, again, we had to approach And then fortunately, an apology was issued in the editorial, unprecedented, that it came through. So whilst we were dealing with all these matters, the relationship with the government was crucial. We had a meeting with the Prime Minister. It called us a meeting with the key Muslim figures there. MCB was very strongly represented. And MCB, along with the Prime Minister, made it absolutely clear. At that time, Tony Blair came out very openly and made it clear that this is nothing to do with Islam. And one should avoid using the word Islamic terrorist, Islamist terrorist. It is a bit of a, what shall I say, a bit of a difficult thing to say, because only a week ago, 2 weeks ago, the reference to Islam and all that extremism comes in is very much there. But anyhow, at that time, yeah, it was.
Just to unpack a bit further. So, sure. I mean, I think at that moment, you know, it was full crisis comms. We need to respond. We need a clear message. And I think Muslim communities, to the best of their ability, tried to do that. But now if we look at 20 years of that journey, so that was 9/11. Now, if we look at the war on terror itself, because there was a very particular drive, agenda, narrative, which we have today, which the MCB has had to really, and I think there was a period of time where the only thing associated to Muslims was terrorism.
Yes.
And the government's security agenda changed to domestic British Muslims and terrorism. So from your point of view, you know, what's been critical, what has critically suffered as a result of all of this, and particularly through your experiences in the MCB, you know, despite all of that, and as you said, it was really given to us as a collective responsibility, but also a bit of a burden that we all had to carry. Anything that happened, you know, you're talking about this confidence.
Yes.
How much confidence is left?
Indeed. Until 2001, that was a very important phase for the Muslim community since the birth of the MCB from 1987 to 2001. And important achievement, if I may say, had taken place in terms of legislation issues, issues of discrimination we were discussing, incitement to hatred, the whole identity of Muslims in terms of the census. All these were very important developments that were taking place. The relationship with the government, with the opposition parties, with the media, all that were really moving on in terms of ensuring that the Muslim community are part of the mainstream community. We are not on the fringe, we are no longer on the fringe, because that was the situation. And now this major incident, major tragedy that's befallen us, the elements who had always been rather resistance, had been a bit of concern, you know, with the progress of the Muslim community, wanted to take us back to the fringe. And this was the challenge that we had. We had to move forward. There had been progress. MCB's position had been vindicated in terms of the attack on Afghanistan at that time. It was futile. It should never take place. Subsequent to other attacks that took place as well on Iraq, the message that came out from the MCB was unequivocal. It was very absolutely clear. And there were elements who were not happy about it, because they thought that MCB would then change its stance and more or less sort of move into what the government wanted in certain sectors. And there were elements who invited us to meetings and said, well, you need to change the stance of your position there. Isn't the fact that they are extremist and criminal elements of the community? Of course they are, but so that they are in every community. You name us where there isn't. Why should we be targeted as a community that takes up full responsibility? So that was one of the major concerns that we had. We did not want to go backwards. There were still issues of the participation in the mainstream that need to take place. There were disadvantages that the community suffered over the years. We need to get that over. And that was the spirit behind us taking a very bold step. We had a tremendous support from the scholars across the country. We brought all the major scholars together, had a wonderful and brilliant statement that came out, and that was taking the media as well, that as far as Islam is concerned, and as far as Muslims are concerned, we are very clear. Our message from our holy teachings, the scriptures were very clear. There was no ifs and buts there, right? We utterly and totally, there's no room for this sort of violence against innocent taking place. And Yet all that efforts that were taking place, there were certain elements within the Muslim community. The fringe element that came out, loudly saying, well, that was a great lesson for the West to learn and all this. And again, we had to deal with it. So we had this challenge with the media, with the other, the sectors that we were working with, and within our own small fringe, which we had to ensure that they were isolated. But sadly, it was that fringe element's voice that was heard most in the media. That was the other sad part of it. Yes, they always brought in us as the mainstream view, but then there was always this element which represented possibly 0.00001% of the Muslim community, hardly any, you can't give a percent to that, yet that was being projected as though this was a Muslim viewpoint as well.
No, definitely. And I guess maybe the final point before we bring in Dr. Hisham, wonderful to have you on, just where are we at? Where are we now? So on the back of the 20 years, and we'll go more into the Q&A, what has the war on terror left us with?
Well, I think what we have heard, particularly after the dismal situation in Afghanistan, where the West literally had to just move out and accept the complete failure of that 20 years of occupation and the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives and the displacements of millions of people in different parts of the world. And now we are not talking about war on terror in Afghanistan only, but in different parts of the world. Iraq, which is in shambles. We hear the situation there taking place on their bases. We see what's happening in Yemen. We see what's happening in Syria. The ongoing situation in Palestine, which we were assured at that time by the Prime Minister that it will be handled rationally, properly, in line with international law and international legal. Nothing of that has taken place. So there was a simple concentration on areas of perhaps invasion is the right way to go about, impose your ideology on the communities. They have got no understanding of it. And now the time has come where they hopefully some realization has come in and they said that this is not the way forward. We have to engage with the community. As far as the UK is concerned, Zara, a great opportunity for the government. But sadly, we are not getting that engagement, that understanding, that discourse, because we are still facing the challenge. It's not just issue of terrorism there, international terrorism. Perhaps the numbers may have decreased in certain ways, but the repercussions of that policy, the prevent agenda, which is in place, and the damage is going on the grassroots communities, is ongoing. And the government is not prepared to try to listen and say, we have learned enough from the damage that it has caused. There are same voices that have come out in Parliament. The former heads of the MI5 and MI6 have spoken against the policies that are in place. Yet we see there's somehow deaf ears on which it is falling through. So I hope there will be a greater discourse, a greater engagement. We are, as Muslim community, part and parcel of the main society. We do not require any special privileges or protections, but we need to be ensured that we are treated equally and fairly like any other part of the community. Our organization, as a Muslim organization, is the largest umbrella body in the UK. We don't claim to be saying that we are the only body, right? We've never had that privilege, but we respect it. And I think that is in the interest of our country and the community, which the government should understand that they need to. We have that understanding within our affiliates, and we have a huge contribution, as we do, also continuously, whether it's issues of health, issues of education that comes in, the social issues, the whole issue of impoverishment and poverty. The community is playing a very important role. So that is part of that issue of engagement, understanding, respect that is required to continue, and then we can see how best we can do it.
No, thank you so much, Sir Iqbal, and honestly, thank you for the tremendous amount of work that I think has been happening in the past 20 years to get our communities to feel confident about themselves. And also, I can imagine, the sacrifice all of the alumni, our predecessors, and everybody involved in the MCB had to put in it, and all across our Muslim communities to also make that happen. I visited the office and found the hate mail that we used to get, and the consequences are very real. But I'm going to bring on our next guest, and we'll come back to you, Sir Iqbal. I'm really delighted that we can have joining us all the way from, internationally, aren't you, Dr. Hisham? Where are you based, right? Are you in the States, or I think you're abroad right now, right?
I am indeed, but I hope to be back pretty soon.
Okay, inshallah. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hisham, for joining us. And we're absolutely delighted to have you on this panel and really important conversation on the war on terror. I know this is of very specific interest to yourself. And just to introduce you properly, I'll indulge in a little bit of your background just for our guests who may not be familiar with your work and your experience. So Dr. Hisham Hellier is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, also a fellow at Cambridge University, a senior associate fellow at the Royal United States Institute in London, and a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a prominent public intellectual of English, mixed Arab heritage, raised on 3 continents. He has been clarifying the geopolitics of the Middle East, the West, the Southeast Asia to publics, governments, globally for more than 2 decades. He has positions at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, the Brookings Institution and American University at Cairo, and University of Technology in Malaysia as part of his dedication to public engagement in the Middle East and North Africa, the West and Southeast Asia. In 2020, he was elected to be the Fellow of the UK's Royal Society of Arts in recognition of his scholarship and analysis in international relations, security and belief. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I guess really to warm up this conversation, leading quite nicely on from Sir Iqbal Sakrani's reflections on the Muslim community and their experience, what would you say the impact of the war on terror 9/11 has been on domestic security and the UK government's counterterrorism policies, particularly to Muslim communities?
So, Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu salam ala Rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. First, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's very nice to see MCB still doing a lot of public work, even against the background of COVID, and especially at a very difficult time. So, I mean, that's a big question, Zara, and it's one that brings back a lot of memories for myself personally, because I remember very clearly how it felt to be in the UK in the aftermath of 9/11. I remember starting my PhD at the time and being asked by a colleague who had just met, well, what do you think about 9/11? I thought, why would I think any differently than you would think about 9/11? So subtext is everything, right? And then, of course, we had our own serious terrorism event 4 years later with 7/7, which, I think brought about far more changes, frankly, in the midst of security debates and discussions in the UK at the time. And there are quite a few things to sort of touch on, but I won't do all of them. I think that we don't have enough time for that. But I do think that the issue of domestic security and CT policies in the UK, though, I think we make a big mistake if we think that this happened as a result of 9/11. Okay. I think actually, and perhaps this is a bit controversial to say, but I think actually we've been heading towards the securitization of our public sphere and discussions for actually a lot further back than that, a lot longer. And I would argue that that's been the case since the Cold War. And I think it becomes more pronounced over time, primarily because of developments in technology that allow for that to take place. That's simply the way the modern nation state works. I realize that sounds a bit abstract and esoteric, but it's something I firmly believe. And when you look at authoritarian states and dictatorships in different parts of the world, actually they're just taking it to its logical conclusion. None of this is good, by the way, all right? I want to make that very clear, but, there was a very interesting piece that I saw in Foreign Affairs a couple of weeks ago by a colleague of mine, Thomas Heckhammer. He said we better get ready for a really long night. And it's a really ugly long night, because that long night involves seeing all of these democratic states quite voluntarily walking into hyper-securitized environments of their own making. Okay, I remember how London changed over time, but how it changed over time, where you saw far more weapons on the streets in the hands of the state, in the hands of and police officers. When I'm old enough to remember when that would have been anathema. Okay, and it's simply not anymore, and that was years ago, let alone now. When you think about what was happening with the Muslim community, that question, I think, is actually far more interesting when you look at it from 7/7 onwards as opposed to 9/11 onwards. Because, 9/11, to some extent, people were able to say, well, that's out there. And it was more out there because they weren't even American Muslims who were involved. So it wasn't, quote unquote, homegrown, It was all about foreign elements doing X or Y or Z. Whereas once you got to 7/7, I remember this being a huge, massive thing for the Muslim community because it put them really on the spot, put them in the spotlight. And it made all sorts of claims and assumptions. And, it suddenly turned out that all policies that related to Muslims had to be about terrorism, either preventing security breaches or by counting on Muslims to be involved in counterterrorism or counter-extremism activities. So, but it's all about terrorism. It's all about extremism. It's all about something quite negative. So housing policy, I remember this very clearly, people talking about housing policy and bringing in issues of extremism and terrorism related to that. And I said, we're talking about housing policy, or arts campaigns, things that really have nothing to do with terrorism or extremism and shouldn't be framed in that sort of way. And, this continues to the present day where, structurally speaking, we put different funds government-wise, into government funds that are used then for, arts and culture and so on, but they're actually out of extremism pots, okay? And that puts a whole sort of frame around how people then pitch for funding, what they do with it, how they justify the funding that they get, and that has a knock-on effect in terms of how communities organize themselves, how they think about themselves, how they consider themselves to be part and parcel of communities or feel more alienated. There's a lot that goes on there, and it differs in different parts of the country. You're from Scotland, it's actually very different in Scotland as compared to certain parts of England and Wales and so on. So, but there are these incredible structural consequences, I think, that you see as a result of that kind of ongoing debate. And I don't think that that's gotten, altogether much better. I think that actually what you've had is a lot of Muslim communities just frankly trying to move on with life, get on with things, and unfortunately accept, I'm not blaming them, but they unfortunately accept that this is the way things are, and they don't give up, but they sort of, accept that, basically the world's horrible, okay? And this is the way our country is. The far right has become mainstreamed in many ways, and they're not wrong. The sort of discourse that I've heard, particularly from 2016 onwards, the run-up to to Brexit, this sort of stuff would have been completely beyond the pale 10, 15 years ago. But having said that, again, I'm probably showing my age, but I still remember when the Austrian chancellor, who came from the far right, this is in the late 90s, I think, Austria was placed under sanctions from the EU because of the fact that they had such a senior member of the far right in government. Today you have Viktor Orban as the Prime Minister of Hungary, and he makes this guy look like some left-wing cuddly, and that's nobody even sort of twitches anymore. That's simply the reality of what it is. Now, having said all of that, and I want to sort of wrap up here, with 2 points. I think that Muslim communities in the UK, of the UK, and I think it's important people continue to use that expressions, they are of the UK, they've developed huge ways of expressing their resilience, and they continue to push forward. In spite of everything, you see more, not less, I won't say prevalence, but more, let's say, examples of British Muslims in public life. You don't see less, you see more. Okay, so for all of everything that I've said, you still have Sadiq Khan, you still have Naz Shah, you still have all of these people in mainstream life. And this isn't contradictory, because this is how societies that move in at a time of flux they develop. Some people will see the opportunity and they'll go for it, and they'll be able to get something in return. And then others are going to do the same, but in a more negative sort of direction. And that's what we've seen a lot with the far right. I do think that we see two types of disconnects, perhaps. One disconnect is between government and Muslim communities writ large when it comes to particularly security issues. And this, by the way, was not always the case. British Muslims are, I would say, famous for being very anti-establishment, and there are many reasons for that, and they're not necessarily bad reasons. But I will say that post 7/7, there was a window where actually there was an incredible amount of goodwill from the community more generally to engage with government, because they genuinely saw there being a threat that brought all of us together, and that everybody had to play their bit. I have to say that window was closed pretty quickly, and in my professional opinion, I don't think that was due to the community. I think that was the way in which government actually engaged at that time, partly by squandering that opportunity, but also by proceeding in ways that frankly were very unhealthy. So there is that disconnect that I think remains, and the disconnect is, it's broadened out because of the fact that you have so much far-right bigotry being actually pronounced from within the mainstream of the Conservative Party. The second thing is that, and this is where I'll wrap up with, I think you've also seen, for lack of a better word, maybe an atomizing of the Muslim community more generally. And, you can't really draw on data for this. This is my own personal impression. I see the idea of national Muslim communities of the UK, as in, a British Muslim community or an English Muslim community, so on, that, they're just far more disparate nowadays. Which is quite, intriguing considering social media and things like this. But actually, I think that community is really far more localized. And it always was very localized. But I think at one point, particularly around 2005, 2004, 2006, you saw more of a national narrative, I suppose, coming about. And now I think that's less so. I think people are far more atomized. There could be good reasons for that. That's just an impression that I've developed in recent years, pre-COVID. I mean, during COVID, of course, is another situation entirely. But the good news is nobody's going anywhere, and I think that people have to be very, very blunt about that. For all of the strength of the far-right narrative being mainstreamed, there's really no suggestion. And by the way, this wouldn't be far from reality in slightly different circumstances. There's no suggestion that Muslims are going anywhere. Okay, and Muslims are here to stay. Muslims continue to play significant roles in public life, in entertainment, in the cultural makeup of the UK, and I think that will only develop further. So nobody's going anywhere, and people have just got to sort of live with that. And I think that once we all get with that, we're all going to get along much better. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Alhamdulillah.
Well, thank you so much for those really, really powerful reflections. Actually, you reminded me of my politics class in security studies, and we were discussing, obviously.
You're calling me an old fogey from an academic institute. Thank you very much. Okay.
No, you're oops. The point of the story was, as soon as we began to talk about terrorism, I was the only Muslim in my class, and I think I just knew I was newly wearing the headscarf as well. But I remember everybody was looking at me and they cracked a joke. Yeah. They cracked a joke, and I just remember feeling so deflated, and I didn't even know what to say. And I think that crushing sense of identity, and how for such a long period of time we were defined by that politics, that even studying it and trying to be productive in it, we kind of lost our way. So I guess my kind of question, more big questions for you, is really around, we've had this prevent duty, and I agree. I think 7/7 was, especially for British Muslim students, that was a complete lockdown in terms of speakers you could have. Because I remember we weren't allowed to host any speakers, people infiltrating the prayer room, looking at our literature. I remember the media, some of our former presidents in my previous organizations on Newsnight having to defend British Muslims and young people. And I think we're kind of at a really interesting, well, we hope, turning point. What do you think in terms of the security agenda today, the relationship between government, the state, and Muslims? Are we at a point of change? And is there something that we can do, or what is that kind of analysis?
So, I mean, this is a very good question. I appreciate it, but the answer isn't an easy one. And what I mean by that is that you have a situation where, as I said, a lot of the rhetoric of the far right has become mainstreamed, and Muslims are a big part of that rhetoric. Okay, so I don't think community as community is really going to be playing much of a role in engaging with policy in any effective fashion. Okay, part of that, and I'll be very blunt, is going to be down to the competency and the capacity of our community organizations. But even if they were the most competent and capable in the world, it would be a pretty uphill struggle. It's not impossible, but it would be a pretty uphill struggle, which is why I continually tell young British Muslims that I meet that you need to recognize that the future of your community and the future of this country, not only are they intertwined, but also you are particularly enjoined upon to develop what we call in academia cultural capital. Okay, and cultural capital doesn't have to mean becoming arts entertainers or things like that. It means having the ability to say that, look, yes, I'm a member of this community, but what I do has a direct positive impact on far beyond my own particular community and the country writ large. And as a result of that, you play into national debates, not as a member of a minority community, but as a British citizen. And I think that that's a very powerful statement. And I think it does make a difference. And I see it, in my own line of work, whether as an academic or somebody who works in policy, I see narratives changing. And they're not changing, frankly, because of lobby groups and community groups on the outside. They're changing because people on the inside are actually making a difference. And I don't mean making a difference purely in government. I'm not saying everybody needs to rush and join, government, whether in the Foreign Office or the Home Office, or so on, although I think that those are also important things that people have to consider. But more broadly speaking, when the media narrative changes on Muslim communities, a big part of that is because there are Muslims that are engaged in the media itself, okay, as producers, as writers, as presenters, okay? You also have media paying attention to quite significant, prolific Muslim figures in different places. When we see media talking about Muslim communities outside of the UK and relying on Muslim experts in academia and policy, and so all of these things matter. Okay, it's not the having an emphasis on simply building up the capacity of community groups. Those are important for other reasons, and they shouldn't be taken as replacements or alternatives to doing much wider mainstream work. That's my opinion. As somebody who's been involved in the mainstream, but also somebody who I hope is being involved and continues to be involved in certain types of community work. I hope that whoever does decide to go into whatever role they choose, that they do so with a good, full intention, and may they see the fruits of that in this world and the next.
Inshallah. No, I absolutely agree. And I think we have maybe one more question. We have time for one more question? Yeah, maybe. So, I mean, I think on the mainstreaming issue, it's absolutely critical. And I think that's one of the reasons, as the MCB today, we are branching out in the policy area that we engage with, not just counterterrorism. But I guess a final question for you is regarding prevent and protect and the government's current counterterrorism agenda. We've actually been conducting a 3-year study, which hopefully we'll be publishing soon, on what next, but we would love to get your insight on, you know, I guess for those maybe not so familiar, I know we've only got a few minutes, but you know, the structural nature of these policies, and I guess, can there be any change there?
There could. I just don't think there's any will for that. You know, I mean, you're talking about prevent. Leave prevent out of it for a second because that's quite high level. Just talk about Islamophobia, you know, a basic definition of what that is. And, you know, the government and the party more generally has been terrible at trying to, not even pretending to try. Okay, let's be honest. So, you know, when we get to prevent, now prevent, I do have to say that prevent is many different things. Okay, and I do think that there needs to be a really wide-ranging sort of appreciation and criticism of what prevent does and doesn't do, and what communities it affects as well. But the broader sort of extremism, counterterrorism discussion, that's constantly going far more in, at least politically speaking, in a securitized fashion. And I don't mean that positively. Actually, when you look at the security establishment itself, they're often far more healthy about a lot of these topics, okay, because they're far more rooted in evidence-based research of, you know, things they can actually see in front of them. And you can have much more you know, reasonable conversations and discussions. And I say that as somebody who, you know, as you said, I'm at RUSI, I'm at the Royal United Services Institute, and I sit in our International Security Studies section. So, you know, there's, yes, of course, as in so many different fields, there'll be people who have biases and, you know, they'll have their own blinders and so on. But you can have actually very forthright conversations and quite open conversations with people in the security establishment who are not generally ideologically always, you know, one way or the other. That, you know, they're trying to do what they're trying to do. Whereas politically speaking, you know, the Conservative Party, I'm afraid, has not been very forthcoming, let's say, on even trying to look at this a different way or even really assess it in a proper way. You know, I mean, what we've seen are very, I have to say, very lame attempts at whitewashing. And it's not been to anybody's benefit, really, and complete abrogation of electoral pledges. I mean, Boris Johnson himself was very clear that he's going to have, you know, this particular inquiry into Islamophobia, said it publicly in a debate, and then he becomes prime minister, and poof, that's gone. It's been repackaged. It's like, that's not repackaging. That's completely abrogating your actual electoral pledge. But nobody cared. And that's what I mean when I say the mainstreaming aspect of this is very important. The cultural capital aspect of this is really important because he did that because he could. He wouldn't be able to if there was sufficient cultural pushback from the mainstream, which there would be for other communities. Okay, and that's a result of building that cultural capital within the mainstream. And it's not a secret, you know, it's not a conspiracy, you know, it's simply doing the work. And yes, the work can take a long time. Yes, there's a lot of effort that's involved. Yes, there are lots of obstacles, and you know, Muslim communities have certain histories of baggage, not their own baggage, but, you know, within the context of the UK. That's all true. And it's all, you know, completely meaningless to continue bringing it up as an excuse, too. Because the fact is that Muslims have already done tremendous amounts and have achieved tremendous amounts in spite of all of these odds, and they can do a lot more. And I think that they will. I think that we all have to have a lot more certainty and clarity of intention, and we'll see a lot more fruits coming from particularly, you know, this coming generation, inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you so much, Dr. Hisham. I'm certainly confident of it, and I guess I must be as the Secretary General of the MCB, but I think absolutely. There's a lot of cultural capital that we need to build, a lot of challenging the narrative, and I guess a lot of real engagement at all levels. So thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to have you, really insightful, and really, really, we're so grateful that you've been able to take time away from another program to join us. And hope
Don't tell
success
anyone.
in
They don't know.
I won't.
They don't know. I have to go back. Okay.
It's just a secret between us, but it'd be wonderful, inshallah, to stay in touch with you, and I look forward to future.
Thank you very much. And if Tabitha is on the line, you have a wonderful media officer there. Thank you very much, Tabitha, and to you as well. It was nice to hear Sir Iqbal once again after so long, and I wish you all the best for the rest of your program. And my apologies for having to depart. Barakallahu fikum. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you so much. And next we are very, very, well, I'm very, very excited that we will be having Baroness Shami Chakrabarti join us. Let us just...
Hello. Good evening.
Good evening. Well, before I let you speak, I'll need to give you a proper introduction. Although you are a woman who needs no introduction and a hero of mine, but Baroness Shami is a human rights lawyer, campaigner, life peer and privy councillor. She was the director of Liberty, the National Council for Civil Liberties from 2003 to 2016, the Shadow Attorney General from 2016 until 2020. She was a Masters of the Bench of the Middle Temple and carried the Olympic flag at the London Games in 2012. She was formerly the Chancellor of Oxford Brookes University and the University of Essex. She has written, spoken and broadcasted widely and is an author of 2 books on liberty and of women, both published by Penguin. And a woman who has not held back, especially in the topic that we're going to be speaking about, but also in a wide range of human rights affairs and civil liberties. So I guess, Shami, thank you so much on behalf of the MCB for joining us now this evening. And, we've had some really powerful reflections from Dr. Hisham and Sir Iqbal, and I guess coming to you now, specifically on the erosion of civil liberties, because I remember markedly after 9/11, the US bringing in a whole series of programs that they were going to be implementing. And then, as Dr. Hisham rightly pointed out, 7/7 was, I guess, a real clear marker for the British government's kind of change of tact. And I think generally this war on terror, the way it also attacked civil liberties. So, and I know you were doing a lot of work around detention at that time. So over to you. Maybe you want to reminisce, I guess, on some of what happened.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you so much. It's an enormous privilege to be here with the MCB, as I feel I was at the beginning 20 years ago when it happened. I wasn't yet Director of Liberty, but 9/11 itself was my second day working as in-house counsel as a senior lawyer at Liberty. So I feel like that day was very, very important to my work and to my life, as it has been for so many people. And it was, I'm glad that I was able to listen earlier on this call, to listen to Sir Iqbal, who I know, but I haven't seen in many years, but we worked together in the past, and to listen to Dr. Hisham, because I feel that there are many resonances between their analysis and experience and mine. It's a bit crass to plug books on occasions like this, but I wrote a book about that sort of war on terror period, which, by the way, in a way is ongoing because of the deep roots and wider ramifications. I wrote a book called On Liberty. A few years ago in 2014, and I was just looking at it again in preparation for this evening, and I think there are resonances with, in particular, Dr. Hisham's analysis. So on the one hand, as a lawyer who had been appointed to look at the future of civil liberties in the UK and what the National Council for Civil Liberties, Liberty, should be doing, I picked up very early on, not just later on 7/7, but I picked up very soon after 9/11 itself, the fact that what had happened, this terrible human rights atrocity, we all agree, in Manhattan, was now going to be a justification for for things that were already in the pipeline. And I think I have to agree with Dr. Hellier about that. So I remember senior ministers at the time saying, everybody is going to have to get used to giving up their privacy now. And that's a statement that was made by a cabinet minister within days of 9/11. So on the one hand, you saw these intrusions into everybody's life, and the most obvious rights to go there were privacy rights, and it was a green light for mass surveillance as opposed to individual, targeted and legally warranted surveillance. And of course, we now know about the Snoopers Charter and massive databases and profiling and so on, which the technology allows and increasingly the law has allowed. So on the similarly, due process rights, fair trial rights for everybody have been eroded, but the experiment and the initial target and the people who felt that change most dramatically and very early on were British Muslims. And in the book on liberty, I just looked back today. I haven't for some time. The first chapter I call "Nothing to Hide, Nothing to Fear," because that was a big slogan at the time on both sides of the Atlantic. But I subtitled that chapter "The Fishbowl and the Three-Walled Prison." And the fishbowl refers to mass surveillance of everybody in the country and beyond, which was now justified. But the three-walled prison was the Belmarsh policy. And I do sound like an old woman now, but this was about indefinite detention without charge or trial or even police interview for a handful, a sort of a dozen or so suspects who were held in Belmarsh prison for several years before the House of Lords, the precursor to the Supreme Court, said that was contrary to the Convention on Human Rights. That was done very soon after 9/11 via emergency legislation, the Anti-Terrorism Crime and Security Act of 2001. And that was an act of solidarity with the Guantanamo policy in the US. It was simple as that. It was shoulder to shoulder. It was a prime minister flying to America to say we're shoulder to shoulder. And of course, there's something admirable, isn't there, about allies being shoulder to shoulder, but some of us believe that real allyship or friendship is critical. And when I see my friend, whether it's an individual friend or an organization or a nation, misjudging a situation and making things worse, not better, it's my duty to point that out. And unfortunately, the US and the UK, in my view, made some terrible, terrible mistakes that weren't just bad for rights and freedoms, acutely bad for minorities like Muslims, but also like foreigners everywhere, like asylum seekers everywhere, like anyone in prison, the securitization that Dr. Hisham described. So very, very acute human rights abuses that end up with extraordinary rendition and torture. And by the way, the war on terror is great for euphemisms. So, if you don't want to read my book and you want something more highbrow, you can read George Orwell's famous essay, The Politics of the English Language. And it's the way in which abuses of language end up with abuses of people. So you use euphemisms like extraordinary rendition, which means kidnap and torture. You use euphemisms like detainee for prisoner. And the war on terror was a war against an abstract noun. And of course, you declare war on something, and then by definition, the rules of the game have changed. That was a phrase that Prime Minister Tony Blair used in 2005. The rules of the game are changing. Well, what game? It's not a game. There's been a human rights atrocity. That's not funny, that's not fun, that's not a game. But equally, the rules aren't just rules of cricket or football, they're fundamental human rights. So we saw acute violations of some people's rights, but we saw broader violations of everybody's rights. And both go together. You cannot separate these things. And I would say, as a human rights lawyer, 20 years later, and I make it my business to speak to younger lawyers who are still at the sharp end and you know, really involved. What's happened 20 years later is we've not really turned things back. And some of the changes that were made have embedded in the broader culture. So, you know, you can see the blurring of criminal law and civil law. You can see all sorts of contortions on the statute book to make it easier to criminalize suspicious behavior that isn't actually criminal behavior. You see mass surveillance, not just of some communities, but of all communities. So this has been bad, not just for British Muslims, but for, in my view, everybody, which is why it's so important, Zara, that the MCB now, as a much more mature organisation, is leading in its advocacy, not just on behalf of British Muslims, but on behalf of the human rights of everybody. And I was particularly grateful to you for your work and your statement on the attack on our Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities in the police bill, because they are a tiny, tiny community compared to the British Muslim community, but they're currently in the front line. They're being targeted not in a war on terror, but in a culture war, because there are cheap shots there and apparently some votes there. And so it's really important now that because of the experience of the war on terror, because of the experience of Islamophobia, and because of the learning and the solidarity of the MCB, you can be confident enough not just to say we must defend British Muslims, but to say we must defend fundamental rights and freedoms of everyone, and especially minorities even more vulnerable than we are. And I think when you do that, as you are doing, Zara, so brilliantly already in your term, you do a great service, not just to your community, but to all of us.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much, Shami. And, you know, I'll ask you a question, then we'll bring Sir Iqbal on as well and have a little bit of a Q&A, but just reflecting on I mean, as a student of human rights law myself, I know absolutely how pertinent it is that defending human rights is something we do for everyone, because it only takes, and we were, you know, the scapegoat of the 20 years, you know, for past 20 years, is you take one minority group and then you see, and Dr. Shah made that very pertinent point about, you know, promises were made, statements were made, but nobody cared, nobody blinked, nobody said, well, you know, no one was defending that cause because it was like, well, it's terrorism and I don't want to be responsible. But I just wanted to take a step back into foreign invasions and Guantanamo Bay and some of the scars that we still, looking back and thinking about what next, part of the problem is the scars are very deep. And, you know,
well, the bottom line is that whenever there is a grave violation of human rights, what you've got is counterproductive counter-terror policy. So it's not just that all of these things, you know, everything from locking people up without charge or trial in Belmarsh, to subsequent control orders, to extraordinary rendition, all the way to drones, to illegal wars and all the civilian casualties of those. These weren't just human rights violations in themselves. They were also devastatingly counterproductive as counter-terror policy, because as we saw previously in Northern Ireland, what you do when you breach the rule of law, you breach your own supposed norms, you breach universal human rights that you're supposed to stand for and fight for. When you breach those, you look like a hypocrite. And you're actually feeding the argument, you're feeding terrorism, you're feeding those who say to alienated, poor, disgruntled people of whatever kind, you know, Muslim or not Muslim, you know, left wing or right wing, when you breach your own social norms and universal rights and freedoms and the rule of law as a powerful person and a government, you actually feed terrorism. You become a quote unquote recruiting sergeant for terrorism in a way that terrorists only dream of, because it's about provocation. And that, I'm afraid, is the security problem that goes with the human rights problem. That is the security problem that comes with all of these counterproductive, illegal, immoral measures. And I don't think I'm alone in saying that. And I think there are many people in the security establishment who now, over the years, have actually said the same.
No, thank you so much. I mean, just to bring you in, Sir Iqbal, we've heard a lot of really powerful reflections on what has gone wrong, the nature and the structural nature of that. But I mean, you've seen, I guess, generations, you know, this past 20 years. I know you've got a lot of experience in even international Muslim communities. What do you think it's going to take now for us to turn the tide and for Muslims to feel once again, well, I don't know if confidence is the right word, but that things are going to change or things can change?
Yeah. I mean, I'm by nature quite confident, optimist. And when this issue of justice and equality and fairness, I think it's a matter of time. And that issue is so crucial because the elements on the other side are always trying to convince you that there is no chance of success as far as you're concerned. Treating us perhaps alien, treating us as something different. But here, it depends on us now. And I think the issue is this self-confidence in us in terms of dealing with those issues forefront. Now we have a younger generation, born and bred in UK. We have a Secretary General in the of the MCB, alhamdulillah, born in the UK at this age, able to understand what is really going on. So this is a huge change. And when I had the opportunity to attend various international conferences, and in fact, many of them came after 9/11, where we were then invited to give our view across. And we took it very strongly. And I must say it was sometimes saddening to be involved in the organization like the Organization Islamic Conference, where 55, 56 member states are there. And, you know, the reluctance for them to handle the issues and take it on forefront was rather shameful. And when we spoke and when we met, and we alhamdulillah, we were, quite keen to meet and convey our message to them, that they have a responsibility as well. When they utter their voices and pronouncement, as it's being heard, and they must be able to see what's been happening from our side as well. So I think those conferences, those interactions that took place, more of it was very, very useful. And I think this is something that needs to continue, much more on a European level, where our connection communities and on the same issues. I mean, fundamental MCB's position has always been from day one, that it is in the best interest of our country and our communities. Yes, we are a Muslim organization. Yes, we have issues much more concerning, like issues which we know, the whole issues of discrimination, the issues of headscarf, the halal food, education. Yes, because that's a disadvantaged situation we are in there. But when we utter our statements, when we talk about issues of bringing about change, it is for the benefit of the society at large.
Absolutely.
And this applies to overseas as well. They need to be aware. The issues of abuse of human rights taking place is not a good example for us. It reflects badly on us, on our communities. Although we must remember that we are not necessarily connected. This is our country, this is our land, we are here. But our religious affinity does connect us. And we have a duty to make sure that that message is conveyed to them.
Classic mute. No, I think definitely on the back of, maybe a question to both of you on the back of, some of the, you're absolutely right. I mean, we have to be hopeful, but 20 years is a lot to look back on and also a lot to change. I guess my question to both of you now, being you are at the start of this and have worked tirelessly through it, do you think that there are structural or maybe parts of society or the state that are quite entrenched and I mean, does this agenda benefit? And is that, because Dr. Hisham was alluding to the fact that, well, are people really, is there really an appetite for change at a leadership level? It's going to be quite tricky. I know, Sir Iqbal, throughout your time in MCB, that, there are just, sometimes it's just useful for it to be the way that it is for certain groups. And I think for a lot of Muslim communities, if we're reflecting now, there is some parts of the community that let's keep our head down and just get on with it. There's the more active parts like myself who are ready for challenge. And then there's a lot of people who had those 3 a.m., security breaking down the door, the detention, families and friends, there's so much to this story than I guess what we can do justice for. But do you think that actually there are just certain parts of society that need it to continue the way it is going?
Who's first?
Oh, Shami, you can go first. Yeah,
Well, I was just thinking, if I go briefly first, then perhaps Sir Iqbal could have the final word before
That's
you have
fine.
the final
Yeah,
word.
The final word, that's it,
so,
yeah.
So just briefly, what I would say is I believe in multiple identity. And there are multiple identities because we are complex creatures. And there are identities that I choose, and then there are identities that people choose for me, whether I like it or not. Okay. And what I found after 9/11, after 7/7, when I was director of Liberties, because I was a brown woman human rights lawyer who didn't believe in detention without charge or trial or torture, people assumed I was Muslim. And, I went out of my way for many years never to say anything yes or no, because I thought, yes, I'm Spartacus. In that, you know what I mean? Like you don't want to, because they were saying it in a negative way, and I'm like, if that gives confidence if that means I'm with the Muslim community, the trendy word for you young people is allies, right? That's the trendy word. But the point is, there are identities people force on us that we then pick up as badges of pride, but there are also identities that we choose for ourselves and ties that bind us within particular communities and across them. So I'm a proud guest at this MCB gathering, but I'm not a Muslim. I'm an ally. You and I are both women. You and Sir Iqbal are both Muslims. The point is, I think, was being made by both Sir Iqbal and Dr. Hisham, which is be confident in your space and your ownership of the space, because you will be advocating not just for the group you represent, but for everyone, and everybody needs that voice. And I can see the MCB has grown and developed, and I see that people have grown and developed too. And this society is ready for, years ago, people were suspicious partly of the Muslim community because they thought this concept of ummah was dangerous, because Muslims might have solidarity with each other internationally. Well, guess what? Humans should have solidarity with each other internationally, whether they're human rights people, whether they're women, whether they're Muslims, whether they're just people who look online and communicate via the internet. So I think there's real adversity, but great opportunities as well that come from this moment, and we can learn some of the lessons from our successes, and there were some. We did defeat the Belmarsh policy, we did defeat compulsory identity cards, and then other challenges keep coming, but there is hope, and the best hope is you and your generation.
Oh, thank you so much, Shami. I'll do my best, but certainly, you're right. There is many intersections is another really strong buzzword, but you're right, allyship, and thank you for being Spartacus and for taking it on for all of us, because I think that is really our new strategy, and I'll reflect on that in my closing remarks. But Sir Iqbal, coming to you, we know Muslims changed their name, shaved their beards, took their headscarves off, changed who they were from top to toe, stopped practicing, at least overtly. Maybe they became more private. We know certain parts of our own community disliked us as the active and very visible parts of Muslims, brandishing the faith and saying, no, we need to we need to continue doing what we're doing, or campaigning for halal, or more mosques to be built. And we also saw the surge in far right and the confidence of the far right, which has really taken quite a turn as well. And do you think, at this point, is part of this reclaiming our Muslimness and reclaiming, I know you're gonna get really passionate on this one, but is there, and I don't think all of that's gone either though, in parts of our society.
No, I think the concept of the multiple identity is quite important for us to understand. And it will be, but has been a retrogressive step if one somehow feels that one needs to now behave in a way that you are part of the main, what should I say, the British society being a non-British Muslim society, right? Now, that doesn't really help your situation. You are who you are. You remain on that basis. Your change of attire or your speech or whatever will not change. At the end of the day, it comes there. And this is, I think, what the new generation, I feel, has taken on. That is why I feel much more confident, Zara. If you look at what has happened, it's pretty nasty events that we went through after 9/11, after 7/7, and I couldn't agree more with Dr. Alia on the major impact it has was the 7/7 in terms of the legislation, but that had come into place, right? The whole government powers that are suddenly being thrown in through the delegated authorities or whatever. Very concerning to the community, particularly to us as Muslim community, the way we've been seeing it by the media and all that. But I think it is that persistence, the feeling of strongness in ourselves, of being together, and not hesitating to speak up when we have to. And I can see the positiveness. Look at the parliament. Way back in, we had how many parliamentarians? It's nice to have a Muslim parliamentarians, like we have the Hindu community, the Sikh community, the African community. They should all be represented. Why shouldn't they be? But we being the second largest faith community in this country, being more than 5% of it is only fair and right that all communities must have. We have had this representation now. There has increased representation in the police force, wearing, constables wearing hijab, all that. These are positive signs that have come about, right? In the armed forces, having a beard or so was not on. Now it's all acceptable and take it on, right? We have got all the different aspects of Muslim societies where we are seen, we are part of it. And couldn't agree more with Shami Pierre that in every aspect of society, we must be there. We should be there, we are part of it. And that hesitancy that perhaps we are not in that field or so is a step backward for us. And I must mention of this brilliant publication that was published by the MCB after 9/11, The Quest for Sanity, where we had eminent authors, scholars from different backgrounds, putting their pace on the whole issue of war on terror. And I think it's a must read. It's got 20 years and it was published, but it is such an important publication that outlines, and what we are hearing and seeing today is some of the reflections that I see being made 20 years ago. So in conclusion, I think there has been, in spite of all the different concerns and setbacks we have had, we have moved forward. I see some positive signs coming in. Yes, the present situation, and we have with the government, as you mentioned, the concern expressed by Dr. Alia, couldn't agree more. It cannot last long. They have to recognize that there is a community. We have community organizations like we have with other faith communities. Why shouldn't there be one for Muslim community? And as rightly mentioned, we are not the only organization, but we happen to have good 500 affiliates across the country, and it's an important voice. A voice that is betterment for the society at large. That has to be come in. And we have got allies like Sane and many others, right? And they have been hugely supportive of us. And I remember going through the time of religious discrimination, had one-to-one meetings with Shami when she was at Liberty. We had those discussions. Tremendous support that came in. Their response in the consultation paper to what we had done, it brought the result that we wanted. And we need to engage many more such their friends across the community that they are, Zara. And that, as you know, we have discussed this. They are more friends than people who do not wish to see us in the place, I think. But we have to take the initiative of approaching them. Publication is one thing. Our newsletters, our statements coming up from Secretary General are an important aspect to get the message across. And inshallah ta'ala, as we believe in the power of God Almighty, that if we do good, we are not on our own. There are people around who will be supporting us. And we must take that very bold step of saying what is right, what is truth, what is haq, as we call it, justice, in there, and refrain and convey the message, as we've been told in the Holy Quran. What is wrong, what is harmful, we need to mention that. Yes, ta'maruna bil ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar. We have to. That is a very powerful message. Show the goodness, show the positiveness, and refrain from doing ill, something that is harmful to the society, and we move forward from that.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. And, you know, picking up from where you both have left off, I guess, just sharing my own reflections on the topic, and I guess, you know, what is next, because I think hearing what everybody's had to say, you know, living through the 20 years as a young person, and now, subhanAllah, having the honor to be the Secretary General, I think there's been such a strong, you know, the outcome of all of this has been the pertinent nature of Islamophobia, even with my own election and the hostility that some parts of society had, the skepticism, even my approach of, you know, inclusion and diversity. Well, you know, do Muslims even care about any of these things? I think there's always this negative skepticism about who we are, but with that, this new emerging confidence that actually we're here, we're British, and, you know, we're going to not only inform and challenge and shape, but continue to be in society, you know, as a contributing force. And I think part of the other parts of this conversation relate to, you know, the counterterrorism and security agenda, you know, which has to change. And it has disproportionately impacted Muslims in such a negative and hostile way that we have literally for 20 years been seen in the prism of securitization, you know, Muslim equal terrorists, or, you know, and I remember in student days, you couldn't host speakers, you know, you were careful about what you said, you could get reported, having the, you know, we know the student with the textbook, and, you know, so it was like so much pressure to be a visibly expressive Muslim, you know, and a lot of our, you know, especially being part of the Islamic society, that is the most active part of the university, you know, and then you had comments from politicians, you know, and as a Muslim woman as well, being visibly Muslim in this space has been so challenging. But I think on the back of all of the reflections and the question, what next, I think it remains for us to answer. And that is really that we can't stop now. And actually, there are many things from a policy point of view that have to change, but a very local and grassroots way is continuing to accept that all of our identities are who we are, and we should do our best to live them. And I'm just so grateful for our esteemed panel, Shami, Sir Iqbal, and Dr. Hisham for coming and for joining in the discussion. Of course, putting 20 years into an hour and a half is quite a challenging thing to do. And a lot of pain, because I think thinking back to it is hardly the most inspiring topic. And I think for all of our guests as well who've joined us, you know, thank you so much. But I think we felt that with such a big anniversary, how could we not talk about it? How could we not reflect on it? And how could we not actually use this as an important steer for what is necessary for us, and also a good impetus to action? But I think on the behalf of everybody at the MCB, you know, thank you so much for your time, service, and commitment to the cause, and we shall continue to champion on our side as well. And please do look out for hopefully our National Listening Exercise report and our work in this space. But beyond this space as well, there is a lot of other things that you can do. And we'll post on the chat how you can get in touch if you're interested. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening in today and for taking your time. And yeah, let's hope for a much better and healthier 20 to 50 to 100 years, preferably. I'll do my time and then hopefully peacefully retire if they'll let me. But have a wonderful evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.
Thank you.